Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 469 of For Immediate Release, the monthly long-form episode for June 2025. I'm Neville Hobson in the UK.
I'm Shel Holtz in Concord, California in the US. We're very happy that you have joined us for our monthly review of what's going on in the communications/technology space. And there is always a lot going on, always. And I heard about a lot of it recently. I was at the IABC World Conference in Vancouver. Small conference, only about 600 people, I think. There are definitely some challenges facing the world of associations in general and IABC in particular. But as usual, the content at the conference was excellent. There were some really good sessions on things like driving AI adoption in the organization, presented by ProSci, the change management research organization, with some really revealing data, some very interesting stuff. For example, Neville, the number one driver of adoption of AI in an organization is the very visible and vocal support from the most senior leadership of the organization. That's
Big
the
surprise,
top factor. And in a lot of organizations, those guys don't have a clue what this is or how it works.
Opportunity for communicators, I would say that signifies, Shel.
It absolutely is. So we have these topics that we are going to jump into here shortly. But Neville, first, why don't you remind everybody what we have already posted since our last monthly episode?
Indeed. Some good discussion we had on a handful of topics since the last monthly show. That was 466, published on May the 26th. And we led in that one. Again, AI features, no surprise to anyone, I suppose, in every single episode we've been doing throughout this year, I think, really. But we started with the topic on AI. Not only are AI chatbots still hallucinating, we said by some accounts it's getting worse. And we had a conversation about LLMs and hallucinating and so forth. Also in that episode, a handful of other topics too, including one I've been reading even a bit more about in the past week or so. So Google's new tool for making AI videos with sound, following the one with text, that's VO. These seem to be coming out of the woodwork from a variety of players, Midjourney, most recently this past few days. So expect to hear us talking about it on FIR during the course of July, I think.
Yeah, I don't know if you're aware, I was hearing about this on another podcast, that these VO videos are being strung together with themes and shared on TikTok, and they're going viral. I can't remember what the themes are, but they're kind of silly and fun. But
there's a lot of that.
The VO3 has really led to this explosion of these videos being shared.
There's around a dozen such tools currently, according to, who was it, The Verge, if I recall correctly. And I've heard of half of them. So new things are appearing left, right, and center. But the Midjourney one, just as a quick aside, I coughed up some money just so I could try it. Blimey, I tell you, this is extraordinary. That you upload a static image and it creates a 5-second video from that. You just prompt it a bit. Or not as you prefer, it'll do something. And I've done probably about half a dozen of these that I'm going to stretch together into a single video. I saw a couple on LinkedIn too, people doing similar things. So for $10 a month, it's worth it to discover what this can do. So expect to see lots of silly stuff out there, but there's a great learning for what everyone else is doing. So it's definitely another phase in these tools.
I have a Midjourney account. I haven't tried that yet, but you've been able to do that on Pica, which I've been paying for a while. So
sure. There are a number of tools that you can do that
on Midjourney. Yeah.
This one I'm seeing in the tech press is saying, oh, wow, over this particular one. So it's offering something,
I'll
I
have
suppose.
to go give it a try.
Go and give it a shot. So we also talked in this episode, this is a bit of a kind of a roundabout way to get to what we talked about in the last monthly. We talked about a new Global Alliance report on lack of strategic leadership about AI's ethical use. See, AI again. And a few other topics, plus Dan York's tech report about a number of services online shutting down and other new ones starting up. So pretty full episode. That came in at 104 minutes. No, wait. 1 hour 43. What's that? Yeah, 100, whatever. Anyway, 1 hour 43. So what?
Nearly an hour and 3 quarters. Math is not our strong suit.
No, it's not. An hour and 3 quarters almost. So that's a hefty but good one, Donna. Thank you for that. So, but that was that one. Since then, we talked in 467 June the 5th, that was Mary Meeker's Trends Report on AI. Mary Meeker, many of you will know this, a venture capitalist and former Wall Street securities analyst, best known for the annual Internet Trends reports that she used to publish a decade ago and going back into the 2000s. Serious credibility. But she released a new one dedicated entirely to AI, 304 slides. Not the most slides she's had at a deck. One of her internet ones was 600 slides, substantial content. But this is worth a read. We talked about it. She has credibility. As we said in the show, credibility as strong as hers. It's likely that this report will become the defining source of truth about the state of AI. So it's definitely worth taking a look at the report and listen to that episode to get our take on what she had to say. And then finally, 468, published June 17th, new threats to reputation. We said while a company's reputation doesn't appear as a line item on a profit and loss statement on a balance sheet, it is nevertheless a critical, intangible asset that significantly influences financial performance and long-term success. So in this episode, we looked at some recent research and reports to zero in on the newest reputation challenges and how communicators should face them. So you're up to date now with that little wrap-up.
We also had an interview.
We did. Yes, we did. That was a really good conversation we had with Craig Silverman. We've interviewed Craig twice before on this episode, but you've got to go back to 2008, 2012 to get those interviews. So well over a decade ago. And here's Craig. We talked to him about Indicator, his new venture that is all to do with fighting digital deception. And he explains how he does all that. He explained how Indicator came to be, the challenges of launching a media startup, and what kind of impact he hopes to achieve. He also shares practical insights for communicators facing the growing threat of coordinated, inauthentic behavior, fake reviews, and AI-generated information. Very timely. That was a good conversation. Almost 3/4 of an hour, we talked to Craig about that, and it was some really good insights he shared. So very much worth a listen.
Could have gone on longer. I had questions when we wrapped up.
Me too.
But Craig is a journalist, trained journalist, and had spent 5 years at ProPublica reporting on disinformation and misinformation. So it was a logical step to move into this independent journalism that he's doing with his partner. So definitely worth a listen.
If you know of Craig, you might remember back 15 years ago, he published a website that was called Regret the Error, pointing out errors made in media reporting. That led to a book deal. And I've got the book. It's a nice look back in time to see what that was all about. But that was a good conversation we had with Craig, I must admit.
Also published since last month is episode 117 of Circle of Fellows, the monthly panel discussion with IABC fellows and a moderator, also a fellow, usually me, sometimes Brad Whitworth, talking about a topic of interest to communicators. This one was different. We did this one live at the IABC World Conference. We had 3 of the 5 new fellows up on stage. The other 2 weren't able to make it. And then we had 8 fellows in the front row of the audience. So we had a camera aimed at the stage. I was at the lectern and the 3 fellows in chairs. And then Brad was out in the audience with a microphone, and his wife, Peg Champion, was following him around with a camera. And all of this was feeding into StreamYard, which we use to do Circle of Fellows. And I was able to do the camera switching seamlessly. And this was all questions from the audience. So it wasn't on a single topic. We went an hour talking about issues that were on the minds of communicators. It's a really interesting episode. So that's available both as a podcast and a YouTube video. We're also preparing for episode number 118, returning to the usual format. This one's on communication leadership. The panelists include one of our brand new fellows, Mike Klein, along with Robin McCaslin, Sue Human, and Russell Grossman. This will be at noon Eastern Time on Thursday, July 16th. So if you're interested in hearing the perspectives of some senior communicators on leadership and communication, tune into that or catch the video or audio replay later. And with that, it's time to turn to our reports. There was a time when digital was something you bolted on to your PR efforts. Neville, you undoubtedly remember those times where should we do something digital? Should we have a website to go with this? I remember when TV commercials had URLs appearing at the bottom, and it was, wow, look at that. They're showing their URL on a TV commercial. PR now is digital. I mean, calling it digital PR is almost, it's just at the center of how we communicate. And BuzzStream's latest State of Digital PR survey is out. And if you're wondering where the industry is headed, this year's survey pulled in answers from 150 digital PR pros across the globe. I guess that means there are PR pros who are not digital PR pros, which is a little worrisome. But there's a lot of food for thought here. So let's start with the basics. What's working in digital PR these days? The clear winners are data-driven hero campaigns and good old-fashioned expert commentary. It turns out about 95% of the professionals out there lean on these two tactics. You need both the big attention-grabbing home run campaigns and the steady, reliable singles. And Neville, I apologize for the baseball metaphors. I don't know the equivalents in cricket.
No, that's okay, Sean, because I probably don't either, so that's fine.
Okay, I should have gone for football so you could have done rugby, right? It's always nice, though, to see that stats back up what so many of us already are doing and just feel intuitively is the approach that works. Almost half of respondents say digital PR is actually more effective than it was a year ago. More links, more visibility, better results. But there's always a but. 72% also say it's gotten more challenging at the same time. If that feels like a paradox, it is. Blame it on everything from industry layoffs to Google's never-ending algorithm updates to the growing army of competitors in the digital space. Basically, the pressure cooker's been turned up to 11. Now, what about budgets? It's not exactly a free spending landscape. Most digital PR teams are working with less than $10,000 a month, and only a handful, about 4%, have more than $20,000 to play with. The cost per link, which is how a lot of these teams still measure value, typically stays under $750. Here's something interesting. A full quarter of respondents are generating 40 or more links per month. If you're into link building, that's a pretty solid haul for your money. And interestingly, link building is still at the heart of most of these digital PR campaigns. So what does success look like in digital PR? It is still all about the links. Not just any links. Quality links are more important than they've ever been, with 87% of PR pros saying that's their number one metric. Tools like RF's domain rating and Moz's domain authority are the go-to yardsticks for measuring those links. And when it comes to relevance, 2/3 of practitioners say they check the page title when the link appears. Little detail, sure, but one that says a lot about the evolution of the craft. Patience remains a virtue. Around half of those surveyed say it takes 3 to 6 months to see meaningful results from a digital PR campaign. For some, it's even longer. Think 6 to 8 months before you really start to notice the uptick in authority or referral traffic. If you're in a hurry, digital PR probably isn't for you. Follow-up emails deserve a quick mention here. A massive 98% of respondents say they send at least one follow-up, and the data shows that it pays off. Sending a follow-up boosts your reply rate by 85%, so consider that a best practice. The best results come when you follow up within a day. Open and reply rates both peak right after the first message. Now, here's why all this matters. Digital PR isn't just about backlinks anymore. It's about driving organic traffic, raising brand visibility, sparking social buzz, and even helping organizations weather a crisis. Done right, digital PR delivers a kind of surround sound effect for your organization. One campaign, multiple touch points. The big takeaway in 2025 is that digital PR is harder than ever, but also more rewarding. It's about mixing hero campaigns and expert commentary, following up quickly, measuring what matters, and above all, being patient. Because if there's one thing this year's survey makes clear, it's that digital PR is a marathon. It's not a sprint. The other thing that occurs to me, Neville, and I think where we're probably going to end up talking, is it's all still about referral traffic to drive folks to a website. And we know that's on the decline because of AI. And I was really struck that they're still talking about success in terms of backlinks and not a word about showing up in AI search results. So, Neville, what was your take on this study?
Probably mirrors much of what you've said, although I have to say I got really down a rabbit hole at the very start where I'm saying, why are we calling it digital PR? Particularly if the definition that I've seen all over the place, including an organization called Digital Marketing Institute, that it's PR, right? And you talk about digital channels. Isn't that a bit of a misnomer now? Because everything's digital. If it's being defined by the channel, that makes less sense to me, even more so. So I think in the report early on, they asked, they have a little section called expert opinions, a little drop down, where one of the questions at the start was, how does digital PR compare to traditional PR? And the quote I liked, and you'll understand why in a second, is from Will Hobson. Hi, Will. US VP of PR, Rise at 7. He says, the lines are getting more blurred, but in my opinion, digital PR is just PR. Our activity needs to be brand relevant, but also culturally relevant while being closely tied to business objectives. Now, you could apply that to PR, and I agree. So we haven't moved on from not calling it digital PR, which emerged when all this was kind of new about 15 or so years ago, where we had digital PR. And I always had a problem as well with digital marketing, where you slap the word digital in front of a job description or a job title or some kind of activity, and it sounds super cool and new and fresh and amazing. And we need to stop doing that because if you then look at these definitions, so the Digital Marketing Institute says digital public relations is a strategy used to increase awareness and visibility of your brand using online channels. That's the first part of it, to which I would say, but isn't that what PR does? Let's call it traditional PR for differentiation. Isn't that what PR does? Digital PR is similar to traditional PR, they say, but it offers the opportunity to reach more people in a measurable and targeted way. I don't know what that means, but that doesn't make sense to me either. I'm not going to get hung up on this because I'm not, but it just struck me is that we've got to stop calling it digital PR. I think your point, though, to kind of focus on this major issue is that exact one about links, driving traffic to websites and so forth. I did think that they had, the report shows some interesting aspects related to SEO that are very much in the domain of this is how we've always been doing this. This is not new. So that makes sense to me. The syndication no follow I found interesting, but I guess the main point is though, if we're going to call it digital PR for the purposes of this article, I'm okay with that. When you get into some of the kind of slicing and dicing of what they came up with, which teams you work with more closely if you're in digital PR. And that I didn't find surprising that the number one by a huge number was SEO, the folks who do SEO, followed by marketing and then PR. So traditional PR is third on your list of people you work closely with. Surprised me a bit to see in this result that strategy was way down the list. And I would have thought that if you're going to, surely we're talking about being strategic. Well, not to coin a phrase, of course, but I hear that all the time. But I would have thought that would have been higher. And I could slice and dice this, but I don't think that would add to our conversation. I think there are things we can learn from this survey, without doubt. But to me, it was obscured by this thing about digital marketing. And I think things are moving so fast that the kind of feeling I get from some of this is that this is not on top of these changes that are moving fast. And I'm thinking in particular about what you and I have talked about in a variety of episodes of this podcast over the course of this year on things like Google overviews, the role of AI in all of this that is going to interfere with all of these traditional sounding plans, it seems to me. So the future, according to this, to my mind, doesn't look very rosy as change is upon us. And this doesn't look like it's addressing change.
Yeah, I don't see them making any pivots here to get ahead of this. And one of the things that one of the speakers at the IABC conference said, I mean, it's an old line. He just sort of changed the words. He said, when change is coming at you, the best companies start running. And you don't have to be faster than the change. You just have to be faster than your competitors. The old line being, when the bear is coming at you, you run. You don't have to be faster than the bear, just faster than the other campers, right? But as I think about the term digital PR, I guess I can see the distinction in the respect of PR as being a reputation management and relationship building activity. I spend a lot of time on the phone with people, which is not digital. There are PR people, chief communication officers, for example, executive communicators, who are coaching their leaders to prepare them for delivering testimony before Congress or preparing them to make a pitch to a city council or a zoning board. There's a lot of PR that goes on that isn't digital. I think what we're talking about with this is outreach, right? And when we're trying to get our message out. So PR messaging is all digital these days, but there's a lot of relationship building and reputation building that doesn't happen online. It happens over the phone. It happens face to face. So I guess we could say that's the distinction.
Yeah, but you got to bear in mind one thing. So if you're using a smartphone, which is digital, then there's digital PR. Okay, digital outreach is what you're doing. No, I mean, seriously, this one of the numbers here, again, not to belabor this point, because this could be a whole separate discussion all by itself. But the number one tactic in the report that we're discussing, which of the following tactics do you consider to be part of digital PR? And the number one, 99.4% of people said pitching data-led content. So it got me thinking, but that to me is crazy, because whatever you're doing in public relations, when you slap a word like traditional or digital in front of it, you are invariably going to be pitching data-led content or data-driven content, whatever. You've used data, or rather you have data and you have used tools to extract meaning from that data. That leads your pitch. So these kind of narrow definitions to me are obscuring the value of these activities and dressing them up with a word that is wholly unnecessary. So Will Hobson's got my vote, where he says he doesn't think this is, we should not call it that. We just call it PR.
I don't disagree. I am thinking back to an old case study. This was when, I can't remember who was behind it, but there was a call to boycott the tuna industry, the canned tuna, because of the inadvertent dolphin catch that was happening. They were scooping up dolphins in the nets, and dolphins were dying, and they were just throwing them overboard because all they wanted was the tuna. And StarKist objected, and I think it was Burson Marsteller that they hired. And Burson Marsteller got the StarKist people together with the people who were behind the boycott. And StarKist said, look, we're already doing all kinds of things to prevent dolphins from being caught up in the sweep of tuna. Look at our numbers. Look at our tactics, the things that we have implemented as procedures to avoid this. And the group came back and said, okay, yeah. And they went out and said, boycott tuna, except StarKist. They're already good guys. That was negotiation. That was getting people at the table. So today, communicating the outcome of that would clearly be digital, but the actual effort was getting people together at a table to hash things out. That's still PR.
So you've just defined why we shouldn't be differentiating it, because that sounds total confusion to the activity.
It's all just PR.
It's all just PR. It's relationship building. These are methods you use to get your message out or engage with someone or whatever it might be. It doesn't define the activity itself. It's indeed, it talks about which channel is its channel, if you wanted to say it's that. But it doesn't help any at all, in my opinion. I would argue that you could apply this digital advertising, digital marketing, digital whatever. It is not helpful. So I'm glad we agree on that, Shell. And I thank Will Hobson for prompting this part of our discussion on this podcast. Hope you're a listener, Will. So let's see. Well, this is a good digital story, this one, Shell, I think. Social media overtakes TV as the main source of news in the US.
Do we need to call it social media? It's all just media. Yeah.
Well, this is another conversation, right? I mean, I'm as guilty as everyone from calling it social media. Indeed, I often talk about social media marketing. So isn't it just marketing? I mean, it's okay.
Every company is a media company.
Oh my God. Yes, absolutely. So this story I'm going to share is actually kind of a subset of a huge report from the Reuters Institute, the latest global report that was published actually just literally a week or so ago in June. But one of the clearest signs of how radically the news ecosystem is changing comes from that report, and that's the bit I want to talk about. For the first time, social media has overtaken television as the main source of news in the US. And by the way, there we have to use the word social to differentiate it from just general media, right? According to Reuters, 54% of Americans now get their news from platforms like TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram, compared to 50% who still rely on TV. Now, I've been hearing for a long time that, more Americans get their news online than anywhere else. So this seems to provide clear evidence of that perspective. And it comes from a highly credible source, the Reuters Institute. I found the reporting, which I'm referencing by The Guardian, was really good at summarizing the whole thing in a way that helps me discuss it with you rather than all the huge chunks of data that's in Reuters' report. But this isn't just a shift in platforms, it's a shift in power, according to The Guardian. Influencers and podcasters, not journalists, are increasingly shaping what news gets seen and heard. Joe Rogan, the famous American podcaster, alone reached more than a fifth of Americans in the days after Trump's re-election. I mean, a fifth of Americans? That's got to be in the at least, close to 100 million, if not more, people, especially among younger men, a demographic traditional media often fails to reach. That shift brings both opportunities and deep concerns. Trust and transparency are now front and center, as news increasingly comes from personalities rather than publications. AI chatbots like ChatGPT and Gemini are starting to become news sources themselves, particularly among under 35s, yet users are already questioning their accuracy and reliability. There's also a darker undercurrent. Globally, news avoidance is rising fast. In the UK, nearly half the population say they sometimes or often avoid the news altogether. And I tell you, Shell, I'm in that group. It's the highest figure in the study, that UK statistic. Many feel overwhelmed by negativity or simply tune out from what they see as repetitive or irrelevant coverage. In my case, it's both in this context. So as the center of gravity shifts from institutions to individuals and from owned newsrooms to algorithm-driven feeds, what does this mean for trust, for civic awareness, and for the role that communicators like us still have to play? What do you reckon, Shel?
Oh, there is so much to unpack here. Let's start with the fact that people are avoiding the news. And I just heard an interview. Kara Swisher interviewed Nicole Wallace on her podcast On with Kara Swisher. For those who don't know Nicole Wallace, she was the press secretary for President George W. Bush. She worked in the upper echelon of the John McCain presidential campaign. She grew disillusioned with the Republican Party and has voted with the Democrats in the last couple of elections. And she is the host of Deadline White House, which is a 2-hour Monday through Friday news program on MSNBC. And she told Kara Swisher that she understands why people are avoiding the news. It's relentless. You watch an hour block of news on CNN, MSNBC, Fox, wherever you prefer to go, and it's an assault of nonstop distressing stuff. Nicole Wallace started a new podcast through MSNBC, and it's not 100% news. It's interviews with A-listers just about whatever they want to talk about. She said it always finds its way to some news, but it's not news from beginning to end. And people are hungry for that. And that's one of the reasons they're turning off the relentless assault of news and opting for either something that has less of it, is more entertaining and soothing and comforting, or presents the news through a filter that is equally comforting in their bubble. Interestingly, as you mentioned, a fifth of Americans listen to or watch Joe Rogan. I was reading that he is turning away from Trump lately in his commentary in the episodes where he is political, because he's not always, but that's going to be an interesting thing to watch, to see if he wields the kind of influence that can sink the poll numbers even lower than they are. But you mentioned using AI tools for the news. I do that, not exclusively, But ChatGPT has the ability to set up tasks, and I have set up tasks to get the latest news on trends in elements of the industry where I work. And every day I check, and every now and then I find something really, really interesting and good out of that. It supplements my other monitoring of the media environment. So it's just one more source, and occasionally it reveals something that I wasn't aware of. But fundamentally, what worries me most about this is the selectivity that people may not be aware they're being subjected to if they go to these other sources for news. And frankly, watching MSNBC or CNN or Fox is the same. The only way I find out what's going on in the rest of the world is to watch the BBC. That's where I find out what's going on in the Sudan, for example, or in Colombia, because they don't cover that on the cable news stations in the US. They're laser focused on the 4 or 5 stories that are going to gin up the most outrage among the audience right now. So it's all the current politics, and that's what's turning people off. And I think if the media wants to maintain an audience, they've got to figure out how to bring people back, how to make these more palatable, because what's missing is the gatekeeper. And I understand that people don't like the idea of the gatekeeper. I can pick for myself what I'm interested in. But if somebody isn't saying this is important and you need to know about this, this is what was great about reading a newspaper. The old-fashioned newspaper is, even if you weren't that interested in the story, you saw the headline and you knew what was going on. Maybe you read the lead, and now you knew what was happening in that part of the world that could have an influence on you and your life at some point in the future. Because when you are curating the news by following the TikToker who presents the stuff in a style that entertains you, what aren't you hearing about that you should be hearing about? And somehow we need to get back to having somebody who can curate what's important, so at least you have a superficial knowledge of what's going on beyond what's in that bubble.
Yeah, that makes sense. Although arguably you could say that particularly the younger generations who are getting their news, etc., from TikTok, it's like they don't care what they don't know, and they don't want someone telling them you should know this.
And that's worrisome.
That's a trend without any doubt. In which case, the way you address that then is to find a gatekeeper, if you like, a source that would be trustworthy enough for them to pay attention to.
Well, exactly.
And that's what needs to happen. I mean, there's some other metrics that pop out of the kind of a big picture we've just kind of discussed that I think, we need to be really cognizant of what the changes are that are happening here. So the rise of news influencers, we touched on that, and we've talked about this a lot in recent episodes. Podcasters, YouTubers, TikTok creators, I hear the word creator a lot, influencer a lot in this context as well, particularly among the younger demographics. So Joe Rogan, as I mentioned, according to this report, he reached 22% of Americans that week, as I mentioned, after Trump's inauguration. But I've read also separately, he himself has been critical of some of the people out there who are so-called sharing news and stuff like that. So is this a generational thing, then I say to myself? I suspect it is largely. But the challenge for all of us, I suppose, are the shifts in the platforms. So there's some statistics from Reuters. YouTube at 30%, Instagram and WhatsApp at around 20%, TikTok 16% are major players in news dissemination. X is losing liberal users and gaining right-leaning ones. So there's no surprise there. But that has a big impact on this big picture. The challenges for publishers, according to Reuters, struggling to adapt to video-driven and personality-led content, struggling to adapt to it, not dismissing it or combating it. They're really struggling with that. Losing commercial value and visibility on platforms they don't control. Facing a bypass of scrutiny as populist politicians speak directly to people through influencers. Now, that is definitely something that we're seeing a lot happening over here in Europe, certainly. News avoidance, we just discussed that, is rising. 40% globally, at least sometimes, are avoiding it. That's up from 29% in 2017. So in 5 years, 29 to 40%. That's a big rise. So The interesting thing I find about the emerging role of AI, to your point, you mentioned that younger users are turning to chatbots like ChatGPT and Gemini, for getting the news, not setting up a program that delivers the news to you, but actually getting the news from those chatbots. I do that occasionally, but I don't say, I'm done, I've got my news feed. No. I'll do it for something specific where I want the benefit of either Perplexity, which was good at this, or I'm not using that so much anymore. Gemini is most interesting how it's doing this, is finding stuff that I know enough about my own use of those platforms that, generally speaking, and this is a very general comment, I trust what ChatGPT tells me. Not blindly, let me tell you that. I check most things, not every single thing. But if I'm getting something that I'm going to make use of in some form, I will double check it myself. And I have encountered recently a couple of things where it's made a mistake. So what do we call that? Hallucination or whatever. And I've challenged it and said, you're absolutely right. Thank you for pointing that out. I made a mistake. I get that, just like a human being might do. So that's how I tend to regard it. But
well, the
this
data
is something
says that these days they're making fewer mistakes than humans undertaking the same task would make. They're not perfect, but they're better than we are.
Well, that's probably true. So I think that's a good way to approach it. That many of the critics I see about ChatGPT, notably, don't seem to do it this way, which is to, I mean, literally, you think of your AI assistant as a person, as a colleague you're working with, and you're asking it to do a task as you would a colleague to do, or a hired contractor, or whatever it is that you're doing. Don't just say to yourself, this is just a program doing stuff. Think of it that way. And when you challenge it, don't worry too much about, working for hours on getting a prompt. Talk to it conversationally. I do that all the time, and it works well, I find. But this is a useful report, and the reporting I've seen, not just in The Guardian, but elsewhere, that zero in on particular aspects of this are worth paying attention to. And I think the one thing I would say that you could argue is not emerging anymore, it's kind of with us, is concerns that persist about the accuracy, trust, and transparency in AI-generated news. And that's something we need to pay close attention to, not to circumvent it or think, no, it's there. That is part of the landscape. So if the younger users, according to surveys like this one, are turning to this, we've got to understand that and make changes accordingly to our planning and be part of the changes that are happening and the shifts that we are seeing right in front of our eyes. That's what we need to do.
Yeah, so there's two angles on this. One is the mainstream media, the TV news media, needs to figure out a way to bring people back, those who are avoiding the news, to make it desirable to want to watch this. I don't know if it's changes in formats or what. We as communicators need to understand how to get the news into the heads of the people who we want to hear this. And that means identifying the influencers, the podcasters, getting stuff on YouTube so that people will find it, making it easier for people to find, and getting into those AI-generated search results. Interestingly, I've heard recently that the AI-generated search results, particularly the Gemini overviews or the Google overviews, are heavily dependent on Reddit and Quora, both of which are other sources that people are going to for news. And these are not places where you can just post your news. You have to go in there and engage. So another opportunity for a strategic shift in the communications department.
Lots to pay attention to, I think.
Yep. Well, there's another major shift happening right before our eyes in the role of the chief communication officer, a shift that's only accelerating as political risk becomes business risk. A new study by United Minds that was reported on Provoke Media shows that CCOs are no longer merely putting out fires, providing executive counsel, and developing basic PR strategies. They're expected to anticipate political and cultural turbulence and shape organizational strategy accordingly. The study makes it clear that CCOs are now business drivers, not just messengers. In volatile contexts, think fractured politics, rising cultural tensions, corporate affairs leaders are being brought into the room to offer strategic counsel. They're expected to flag risk, convene cross-functional war rooms, and guide public positions. As Ben Kalovich from United Minds puts it, with an audience of one in D.C. that can and will quickly strike, CCOs need to lead their organizations to make the right decisions. That's a weighty responsibility and one that requires a shift from reactive communications to proactive leadership. In companies that embrace this new model, the CCO serves as a kind of stabilizing board voice, a steady hand while other leaders overreact to daily political noise. Interestingly, that's kind of what the Melbourne mandate called for, 13 years ago from the Global Alliance? They called for PR to be at the center of maintaining that steady guidance through political turbulence and social turbulence. Anyway, the organizations set up frameworks monitoring political signals, introducing decision protocols, and convening diverse teams early. And the result of this is anticipation of contentious issues like DEI or AI regulation, and the ability to respond with unity and credibility rather than scrambling under pressure. Not every organization is embracing this shift, though. In more traditional companies, communications is still seen as downstream messaging. Boards and CEOs may say they want early risk warning, but when the CCO raises a flag, they end up getting marginalized. As Dave Tovar of Grubhub noted, CCOs are caught between expectations, knowing they should warn but lacking authority to influence outcomes. Picture it, telling the company the winds are shifting, but not being allowed to change course. This tension between leadership resistance and expectations creates a double bind. Leaders may resist expanding CCO's remit, preferring to keep them in a PR silo, but then when political or reputational risk escalates, they demand answers. The CCO is stuck, expected to prevent or manage a crisis, but without the platform or agency to do it. That gap undermines both credibility and governance and risks turning strategic warning into a career killer if leadership ignores it. We've seen indicators that the pressure on CCOs is rising. A recent Axios survey reported a 10.5% turnover rate among global CCO roles in 2024. That's up from 8% the year before. Why? Because these roles are expanding and not every executive ready or empowered to lead with that level of complexity. A lot of these folks are hired for the moment and then find themselves lacking when volatility demands broader strategic competence. That signals a growing divide between what companies want and what communicators are equipped or intend or invited to deliver. So for CCOs navigating this evolving role, there are a few paths forward. One, step into the advisory space. Build political risk frameworks and cross-functional coalitions before these crises emerge. Second, map your internal networks. Engage peers in legal, government affairs, HR. Trust and influence are built pre-crisis. And finally, translate your role. Reframe your value not as PR, but as strategic insight, especially to boards and CEOs. But if none of this sticks, unless leadership both expects and empowers, reducing resistance has got to be an area of focus.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, that's a complicated picture you've outlined there, Shell, I think. But it makes sense for the chief communications officer, in particular, that role, to be truly strategic as a valued advisor, a counselor, more than just the words that we see bandied about what the role of a communication professional is. Always a counselor or advisor to senior leadership. This goes much, much deeper than that. And I think it's not new, the depth of this, but in the context of where we're at today with all the things that are going on in the world that could, not so much could impact us, but that we ought to be paying attention to, because this is the world in which we're doing business and living. Political risk is a valuable attribute for somebody to be able to provide guidance and insight to leadership on in a way that they are trusted by those leaders to do that. So if you want to get a seat at that table that we hear about as a trusted advisor, this is a route, but it's complicated. It really is high risk. And what you outlined, the reality of human behaviors and the ways in which we engage with others in a work environment, you'll be marginalized, you'll be sidelined, you will not be supported, you'll be sabotaged, all that stuff if you don't do it right. And it sounds a pretty trite way to say it because it's wider than that. But you need to have all your ducks lined up. You've got to have support. You need to have that network to support you, and you need to show your value in supporting others. I mean, this is a diplomat's role as well. So I think I don't know anyone, just going through my mind, I know a number of people with the CCO title in large corporations as well, but not anyone I could think of who I could say, yeah, this person will be a role model for this kind of role. It doesn't mean to say there aren't any. I just don't know any at the moment. But I think this is a natural evolutionary step for a CCO in a large enterprise in particular, particularly in a let's say, controversial to some industry. Pharmaceuticals comes to mind. Actually, armaments comes to mind, although that's probably a hot one to be in that right now, in that you don't need to try and persuade customers to buy your product, but the way in which you are able to navigate the political risk is key. So, I couldn't offer more than what I just said, Shell. I think it is a fascinating topic to be discussing, given the context of where we're at in the world.
Yeah, the report didn't list industries that are struggling with this more or less than others, but I suspect one of the toughest places to be a CCO right now is in big tech, because you have CEOs, many of them, I'm not going to say all of them, but many of them now see themselves as entitled to rule the world. And are they going to listen to a CCO who says this particular cultural issue is going to affect us negatively if we don't get on the right side of it, or if we don't communicate it effectively with key stakeholder audiences? They're going to do what they want to do. And I imagine that's a tough place to want to be strategic in terms of what this report is talking about.
Agree, to which that adds even greater urgency to one element of the CCO's activities, which is building strong alliances with senior people in the organization. So it's not just he or she alone going to the CEO saying, this is what we need to do. He or she's got the backing of many people that also have an influence with that CEO. It's easy to discuss this, and I realize that it probably isn't easy actually in real life to put this into practice, but that's what you're probably going to have to do, I would say.
Greetings, Shell and Neville, and FIR listeners all around the world. It's Dan York coming at you from the Montreal, Canada airport. I'm actually heading to Calgary, where Rotary International is holding its global conference, and I'm going to be attending out there. So that's where I'm off to for the week. But I want to talk about what happened last month. A number of things. The news coming out recently is that President Donald Trump has extended the stay of the TikTok ban. So TikTok continues to live in the United States for a period of time longer. We'll see what happens there. Another piece of news was that Twitch, the live streaming service, recently announced that they are going to start supporting vertical streaming. If you're familiar with Twitch, for the longest time, it has been supporting landscape, just kind of regular desktop view streaming. But they're now moving into, or they will be moving into supporting live vertical streaming, but also the ability to stream in both directions. So you could have one stream going out that would go both vertically and horizontally. So very interesting to see where that's evolving and where things can go. Another little piece of information in the world of Mastodon that I spent a lot of time at. One of the interesting things that happened this past month was that Mastodon.social, which is one of the largest Mastodon servers out there, changed their terms of service to prohibit any kind of scraping by AI devices or AI systems. This is an interesting move in the time when so many other systems are looking at how do you prevent just the raw sucking up of all the information as training data for AIs. We'll see where that all goes, but interesting that is now a change in the terms of service. And we're seeing that on many other sites as well. Partly saying, these large LLMs are, hitting our sites to accumulate a vast amount of data without any cost and at a use of resources. So, we'll see where that all goes. Something else, though, that I want to mention is that this week, the week of June 23rd, the United States Supreme Court will be handing down a verdict. This week or next, they have to do it before the beginning of July, on a case called FSC v. Paxton, or the Free Speech Coalition v. Paxton. And it's around a bill that would require websites with more than a third of content that's sexual material harmful to minors to use reasonable age verification methods to be sure that somebody is 18 years or older. on one hand, this sounds like a reasonable thing, but the challenge is that the current state of age verification methods don't really make it easy to determine whether somebody is a minor or an adult. And it requires really kind of everybody to provide their kind of ID in some form. So it's not just age verification of minors, it is actually a way to have to go and check everyone's ID, which is a little bit different than how the internet has been up to date. But we'll see where the Supreme Court rules. It'll be coming out probably the end of this coming week or next. Now, speaking of rules and the internet and everything else, there's two big UN conferences happening in the next several weeks. This next week, of June 23rd, in Norway, near Oslo, is the Internet Governance Forum, or IGF, which brings together people from all around the world to talk about how do we govern this internet in a way that's sensible and remarkable in some different way. And so there'll be all sorts of discussions around every possible topic you can imagine. But if you look for the Internet Governance Forum, or IGF 2025, you'll see all sorts of things coming out and discussions happening and pieces are there. Many of the discussions will be about something called the World Summit on the Information Society, or WSIS, the 20-year review, which is happening a couple of weeks later in Geneva, Switzerland. I'll actually be there for that as part of my Internet Society work. But this is an agreement that happened back in 2003 and in 2005, charting out how the world works with regard to how the nations of the world work with regard to governance of the internet and just general interaction with the internet. The important part, what my organization and what others are looking at, is how do we ensure that everyone has a voice? Right now, the so-called WSIS system supports what we call multi-stakeholder, everybody being involved. You know, governments, commercial interests, nonprofits, academics, regular companies like many of you may be working for. We all have a voice through this Internet Governance Forum. There are some governments that would like to push back and have it only be that governments are the ones that get to say about the future of the internet. So this is something to watch, this WSIS, as it's called, or the WSIS Plus 20 review over the next several weeks, and heading into the fall with the United Nations General Assembly and later into December. This will set a lot of the direction for governments of how they engage with the internet. So something to pay attention to and think about. Anyway, that's my report for now. I hope you all have a great month, and I'll send it back to you, Shel Neville. Bye for now.
Hey, thanks for that report, Dan. And also, Dan, congratulations on your job change. I don't know, Neville, if you heard about this, but...
Indeed, I did. I saw Dan posting about it. Yeah.
Dan is now the chief of staff to the head of the Internet Society. So just big shout out. That's a tremendous move, and congratulations on that.
So let's talk about something unusual and increasingly important that's happening at the intersection of faith, ethics, and technology. At the second annual Rome conference on AI held last week at the Vatican, attended by executives from Google, OpenAI, Meta, and more, Pope Leo XIV made a bold call. AI must be developed within an ethical framework that upholds human dignity, not just innovation for its own sake. He's positioning AI ethics as a signature issue of his papacy, something that's been widely reported in some of the mainstream media, notably the Wall Street Journal just a few days ago. He's doing this in the same way Pope Leo XIII, so one number less than what Pope Leo XIV is, and some 100 years in between, once defended factory workers during the Industrial Revolution. But this time, it's not about wages or working hours. It's about what it means to be human in an age of intelligent machines. Crucially, he's not rejecting technology. He's confronting its unregulated ambition, warning against the illusion that access to data equals wisdom, and calling attention to the risks to children's development, justice, and even spiritual well-being. What stands out is how Pope Leo is reframing AI, not as a technical or economic issue, but as a spiritual and societal one. He's using the church's global moral influence to challenge the Silicon Valley narrative, especially the idea that salvation might one day come from code rather than grace. And this brings us as communicators into the frame. As I explored last week in a post on my blog referencing a deeply analytical report by the Wall Street Journal, we have a strategic role to play here, not just translating complex technologies, but interpreting what they mean for people and tech. We're often the ones asking the hard questions about trust, power, and impact inside organizations. So when the Vatican calls for ethical restraint in the face of AI's rise, it's not just a headline, it's a reminder that we too need to help shape the values that drive technological progress. The Church is offering one model of how to do that, through moral clarity, digital diplomacy, and deep reflection on human dignity. This is not just a church versus tech story. It's a lesson in how moral authority, strategic dialogue, and long-term vision can influence how the world adopts powerful technologies. Communicators can draw on this in multiple ways. Elevate ethical concerns internally, lead with principles, not just performance, and frame AI not as a product, but as a public conversation about who we are becoming. The Vatican is showing that digital diplomacy doesn't require dominance. It requires clarity, conviction, and credible values. That's a strategy worth studying, I think.
It is, and this is going to be an interesting dynamic as Pope Leo makes this the centerpiece of his papacy, at least in the early days, because it is at odds with at least the U.S. government, the current administration's position on AI, which is all gas, no brake. They think that we need to accelerate development and adopt the Zuckerberg philosophy of go fast and break things. And it's troubling. And it's good to have that voice out there. But then you have J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, who is a Catholic. I believe he's a convert to Catholicism.
Yeah,
and
I read that.
He's out there saying, go, go, go. Let's build, build, build. Get this stuff way out ahead of what every other country is able to do. The Pope, interestingly, has some allies, and it would be interesting to see if the church does ally itself with some other institutions that are promoting the same message. One of these is the Global Alliance for Public Relations and Communication Management. This is the umbrella organization. In fact, we've mentioned them, I think, a couple of times so far in this episode. They're the organization that represents the world's public relations and communications associations. They represent close to 4,000 communicators worldwide. IABC is a member. The Chartered Institute of Public Relations is a member. Most of the world's associations are members. And they have just released the Venice Pledge, so-called because it was hammered out in Venice. In fact, they say it's a result of a collaborative AI symposium workshop session held in Venice, Italy, hosted by the Global Alliance's European Regional Council in partnership with FIR, the Italian Federation of Public Relations, as part of the Global Alliance's Technology Trends and Communication Transformation Month in May. This was signed by the board, passed by the board in July. Let me read this just so everybody can understand what they're saying here and see how it aligns with what Pope Leo is saying. The Global Alliance defines responsible AI as the ethical, transparent, and human-centered development and application of artificial intelligence strategically deployed to support, not replace, human judgment, creativity, and communication. It emphasizes accountability, fairness, and accuracy while minimizing bias, misinformation, and harm. Responsible AI upholds privacy and data protection, reflects professional and organizational values, and ensures proper attribution, governance, and human oversight to maintain trust, integrity, and societal well-being. The 7 responsible AI guiding principles are ethics first, human-led governance, personal and organizational responsibility, awareness, openness, and transparency, education and professional development, active global voice, and human-centered AI for the common good. And they are asking communicators to sign the pledge. We will have a link to this in the show notes. And if this is something that you agree with, by all means, give it a click and sign the pledge. It's fairly benign. I don't see anything particularly controversial there. It is, though, I think entirely aligned with what Pope Leo is saying and very much at odds with the U.S. government's approach to AI, along with the approach being taken by most of the big players in the industry.
So I just want to go back to Leo, actually, because this is not an agenda we've got yet. Pledges and so forth, I believe, are way too soon for that kind of thing. But I get what the Global Alliance is doing. What this story is about really is about the change that is happening, the way in which the Catholic Church is engaging with hitherto people who are highly critical of what they are saying, so big tech in particular, and continuance of let's call it digital diplomacy that started around 2020, so five years ago under Pope Francis, that has led to meetings with the leaders of all the big tech companies, the big six, I suppose you could argue, if not including some others, I'm sure. And this meeting recently that I mentioned is another step forward in that journey where they're looking to, I guess, illustrate the value of principled dialogue, although I think it also highlights the limits of voluntary codes and the need for firm accountable governance. And that's the bit that I think is going to be the critical one. Can Leo, as the head of the Catholic Church, move the needle on that, where we have a lot of talk around the world about regulation, for want of another word, and various things happening, but that hasn't really moved any needles yet. But I think Pope Leo is going to be far more tech-savvy, regulation-minded voice than his predecessor, who was not as informed. Both pontiffs shared a deep concern that I've read a lot about that innovation without ethics risks eroding the very dignity it promises to enhance. And that's their starting point. So communicate, that's you and me and all the others listening to this, can help bridge that gap to increase the understanding of that. But I think the fact that the Vatican is taking this, it's certainly not news headline making everywhere, but increasingly I'm seeing reporting on these steps that the Vatican is taking. So as I mentioned, over the past decade, actually, they've held private meetings with tech leaders. So Mark Zuckerberg, Tim Cook, Brad Smith, Eric Schmidt, and others more recently. Many took place under the umbrella of the Minerva Dialogues. That's another grouping of meetings that took place privately, convened by a number of very influential voices, senior church leaders in the Vatican. And they're continuing. And they moved reportedly from enthusiasm about connectivity to deeper concerns about AI. So you're seeing a convergence meeting of minds on certain aspects of this. So concerns about AI, misinformation, polarization, and this phrase I plucked from a Vatican report, the nature of truth. I thought, hey, they should get Donald Trump in there then if you want to talk about the nature of truth. Vance would do, I suspect. But the point to me, though, is that I think this is a massive shift in possibilities over this broad topic that everyone in the whole world seems to be struggling with. And yes, we can have pledges. And like you, I think from what you've said, I've not read it myself. It doesn't seem to be anything in there that would cause a conflict to anyone. You're pledging that you would follow these things, and you are likely, in fact, I can't imagine anyone is going to say no to that. Anyone you're going to take seriously, you're going to say, no, I'm not going to follow these things. Of course you are.
Elon Musk wouldn't sign on to that pledge.
Well, he's not a person in our circle of conversational focus even. But I think what we're talking about here is a sea change that is only just emerging into the public space, and it's early days yet. I mean, Pope Leo has only been in the role for 2 months, less than that even. But we've got the moves the Catholic Church making. The reason why I think this is so significant is they're engaging with Silicon Valley on the one hand. They are now promoting quite strongly the ethical frameworks that they have had discussions with various people on. So another one, the Rome Call for AI Ethics. This body in the Vatican called the Pontifical Academy for Life. That's a pledge that Microsoft, IBM, and Cisco have signed. And that was launched in 2020. That laid out the principles of transparency, inclusion, and responsibility. But one thing I found interesting, Shell, Google and OpenAI have not signed it, not yet. So that highlights the unresolved tension between tech autonomy and ethical oversight. So there's a hurdle to get over at some point. But shaping global discourse, this is something I remember this. Pope Francis, he spoke at the 2024 G7 summit, warning of a technological dictatorship and calling for legally binding treaty on AI governance. The 2025 G7 meeting in Canada has just happened. No news about that, but I think Pope Leo undoubtedly is going to carry that mission forward. But here's the thing, firmer, more technically informed posture. He's going to talk like he knows the topic he's talking about. So these, to me, are converging into something quite interesting. Symbolic and narrative power is another one. And this Pope is very savvy on all of this. So, for instance, referring back, you remember this, I'm sure you will, the AI-generated image of Pope Francis in a white puffer coat went viral in 2023. It exposed the public's vulnerability to deepfakes and the church's symbolic visibility in digital culture. But rather than dismiss it as a joke, Pope Francis used the moment to amplify concerns about truth, trust, and the limits of data, which is an example of value-led narrative shaping. So all these elements are happening. So I think pledge is great, and I think it'd be good for other professional bodies to either support this as a single initiative or come out with their own. Where is the harm in doing this? It's not affecting anything that's going on here, I don't think, because let's not forget, this is aimed at a wider societal grouping as opposed to narrow demographics, let's say. But this to me is a very interesting time, and we are seeing the possibility, I believe, and there's me with always my glass half full view of a big change happening that can only be a good thing.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with the thing that you said. Okay. I think you asked if this is moving the needle, and my answer is the likelihood of this moving the needle increases with alliances, if you can bring more people into this fold. And I think if you look at what the Global Alliance is doing, and put the request to sign the pledge aside, just saying this is our code of ethics when it comes to dealing with AI, and we are asking communicators to abide by this, that is entirely consistent with what.
Do you remember conversations we had a year or so back about we don't need code of ethics for AI because we've got a code of ethics? And I think this illustrates actually why we do need something specific for AI.
Yeah, I think they'll come together at some point when AI has become so routine and is just a part of life.
Yeah.
But right now, yeah, I agree, especially because of the risks that we're seeing. I still, in my heart, believe that if you read IABC's Code of Ethics, PRSA's, CIPRs, it's all covered there, but it's not explicit, it's implicit. And right now what we need is for things to be explicit.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's lots for communicators to absorb in all of this. So if you're interested in the devil being in the detail, we'll have links, or there are links in the show notes for this episode for that Wall Street Journal piece I mentioned. It's lengthy, extremely, deeply analytical. It's behind a paywall, unfortunately, but there are probably ways you can get into it. There's also a linked article I wrote about in my blog, which I found rather fascinating. It was from the Catholic Herald. I'm not a sudden conversion to reading religious publications, by the way, but in the focus of my interest, I'm encountering these stories. But they had an interesting analysis of transhumanism. Now, I have a number of deeply Catholic friends whose eyes rolled when I told them about this story, because this, to me, is a major issue for the Pope to grapple with, where transhumanism, if I understand it correctly, is all about it's not salvation you're going to get from a god when you die. It's likely to be from computer software, and software engineers are the new priests. I mean, that's the take I'm reading from the Catholic Herald's article. I don't agree in any shape or form with that, but nevertheless, it's a point of view. And that's part of the conversation too. So you've got to take care of that. We'll have a link to that in the show notes if you want to read it. But Wall Street Journal piece, this piece, CNN article, which is talking about the meeting that just happened this past few days. And then, of course, there's our conversation. So there's a lot to unpack from this. And if you have comments to share, we definitely want to hear what you think.
Yeah, and, we've been talking about this for years and years, but now it's coming to pass. I just read in the New York Times about a guy who has about 2 months left to live and is working with his son to create a digital version of himself that the family can continue to interact with after he's gone. So, this is something that we anticipated. It's here.
That's right. You're absolutely right.
What does that do to the idea of mortality? There's so many philosophical issues to address.
Goodness.
I am concerned about internal communications. Internal communications is where I spend most of my time. It is what I'm most passionate about in the communication space. And you hear a lot these days about how internal comms star has risen. It was the pandemic that it was the catalyst for that as communications became more important to senior leadership. And now we're more strategic and we have the seat at the table and blah, blah, blah. And all of the data that we're seeing about problems with connection in the workplace suggest that we're not doing as good a job as we're giving ourselves credit for. This growing disconnect inside the workplace is sapping productivity, it's undermining culture, and frankly, costing companies a lot more than they realize. So let's talk for a couple of minutes about the hidden costs of internal disconnection and what smart strategic internal comms leaders can do to close these gaps. Let's start with a stat that jumped out at me from a recent Axios HQ report. A stat that gets right to the heart of one of the biggest problems I see with what internal communicators do every day. The data says employees lose more than a month of work every year just trying to find information, clarifying confusing updates, or waiting on other people to respond. We're talking about 41 workdays per year per person. Do the math, and that's about $20,000 in lost productivity for every employee. All that time chasing down answers or trying to interpret vague emails adds up. And let's be honest, this is not just a minor nuisance. For most organizations, it's a massive silent drain on resources, and much of it's preventable. So what's the fix? It starts with clarity and consistency. We need to deliver the right information at the right time in the right way. That might mean tighter, more concise updates. Maybe it's a centralized digital hub where people know they'll find what they need. Maybe it's just making sure leaders are trained to write and speak with a little more empathy and a lot less jargon. But it also means that internal communicators absolutely must start devoting some of their attention to how communication happens within the organization between other people and between departments and functions, not just the formal messaging between leadership and employees. When was the last time a communicator that you knew did a process audit to see what messages are being sent by processes? This ought to become a key area of focus. Now, the same Axios report had another stat that's alarming. 8 out of 10 employees say the quality of internal communication affects how well they understand company goals. But only about 9%, that's just 1 out of every 10, feel they're fully aligned with those goals. That's not just an internal comms problem, that's a business problem. If people aren't clear on where the organization is headed or why it matters, how can we expect them to bring their best to the table? And if internal comms isn't about alignment, I don't know what it's about. Here's where internal communicators can make a real difference. And I'm not talking about an all-hands meeting or a CEO memo. Short, frequent touch points from leadership, weekly what's important notes, town halls that actually allow employees to ask questions. And maybe most important, managers translating those big picture goals into the realities that their teams face every day. Now let's talk about frontline workers, people in retail, healthcare, logistics. Fast Company shared some eye-opening findings from a WorkVivo study. Nearly half of frontline employees don't even know who their CEO is. This is just staggering to me, although based on a personal experience, it's not all that surprising. When I was running communications at Mattel, we did quarterly CEO town halls, but only for manager and above because we didn't have a space big enough for everybody. And I convinced leadership that let's do a second one. And they said, okay, we'll bring all the people from below manager into the other one. So they weren't going to be mixed groups, which is what I had in mind. And so they had the second town hall. The CEO got up, did his dog and pony show, same thing he had done for managers and above. And afterwards, a group of admins walked up to him and they were just so effusive. They said, this is so wonderful. It's so great to be included. We never get to hear this stuff. We understand so much more of what we're hearing about now. We just have one question. Who are you? He didn't introduce himself. He assumed, I'm the CEO. Of course, everyone knows who they are. And at the front line, that's one hell of an assumption. So even more employees in this research say the broader company culture doesn't really apply to them, and only 9% are truly satisfied with internal communication. If that doesn't sound like a crisis for communication, I don't know what does. So what can internal communicators do? Well, for starters, we have to get creative about reaching people who aren't sitting at a desk all day. More mobile-friendly platforms, digital signage, even a quick weekly video from the CEO specifically for the front line. And crucially, two-way communication channels, places where frontline employees can ask questions and get real answers. Now, here's a twist, and I apologize. I know this is a longer report, but there's a lot of this stuff happening out there. According to a recent piece from the New York Post, Gen Z employees, those just starting their careers, are shying away from office small talk. In fact, 3 out of 4 say that they struggle to strike up conversations with coworkers. It might be tempting to chalk this up to generational differences or social anxiety. I think it's deeper than that. As more work moves online and hybrid, those water cooler moments, as we've talked about frequently in the past, aren't happening organically. And that's a problem because informal interactions is where trust is built and where silos are broken down. Internal comms can help here too. Can't force small talk, but we can create spaces for it. Slack channels for non-work chat, virtual coffee breaks, or interest groups that let people connect over something other than deadlines. We just launched a new intranet. It has communities, and I made a point of setting up some communities that are not work-related. Share pictures of your pets. We have one that somebody set up about video gaming, and this is where you're going to have the opportunity for those kinds of interactions and for people to meet. Then there's the infinite workday. This is a term that came out of Microsoft's Work Trend Index, and it describes a world where work bleeds into evenings and weekends, especially for remote and hybrid teams. Gallup reports that millions of employees are stuck with unpredictable schedules, making it hard to find work-life balance or plan family time. Role here for internal communicators, too. We can model and promote boundaries, publicly acknowledging that it's okay to log off at a reasonable hour and celebrating leaders who actually do it. We can make sure employees know about resources for mental health and well-being and check in regularly through pulse surveys or just simple "how are you doing" moments. And we can recognize how different employees from different generations perceive this issue, especially given the micro-targeting of employees that's increasingly possible with AI. For example, I learned at the IABC World Conference that Gen Z is not Millennial 2.0. They're not interested in work-life balance. They're interested in work-life blend. That seems to me to necessitate a different messaging to millennials than we're sending to Gen Z. So all of these issues share in common symptoms of disconnection to information, to leadership, to each other, to the mission of the company. That's why internal comms isn't just a nice to have and why we have to stop resting on our laurels. We are the nervous system of the organization, and when it breaks down, everything suffers: productivity, culture, retention. So my challenge to communicators who work in the internal comms space: audit your channels and messages, who's being reached, who isn't, and what's getting lost in translation. Design your strategy for real inclusion, not just efficiency. Make it two-way and make sure that the voices of the front line and Gen Z and everyone in between are actually being heard, and measure your impact. It's not about how many emails you send. It's about how much time and confusion you save.
That's quite a story, Shell. Here we are in 2025, and you've outlined stuff. I remember hearing about all this stuff in the early 90s. And the bit about not knowing who the CEO is truly staggering, I have to admit. So if that's a picture that is part of the bigger picture, let's say, then that doesn't look good for communicators, I must admit. To throw into this mix, a question in my mind listening to you was, okay, fine, this is all great. What do you do? How do you do this in a hybrid workplace? Meaning work from home sometimes, work in the office other times, or as we hear occasionally, there's some companies where some people don't go in at all, others where the climate is they're forcing people to go in, so the environment is not a good place. I read on LinkedIn, and I didn't bookmark the person who posted this, unfortunately, but Mark Reed, the CEO of WPP, the advertising agency, speaking at South by Southwest in London last week, said he talked about hybrid working and the future of the workforce with AI, blah, blah. Essentially, he said people are happier when they're in the office.
That's just not true.
Which I've seen people commenting. I've seen people commenting on, what? I mean, are you nuts or are you stupid or what? You know, is it without any explainer, as I understand it? Nothing to say, here's the data that supports that view. But if you've got a CEO saying stuff like that, then that doesn't look good at all for being able to achieve some of the things you outlined in your call to communicate or call to internal communicators. But
it's another disconnect. Those employees in the office going, what, are you nuts? How's it possible to align with your CEO when your CEO is making statements like that?
Yeah. I mean, PR Week has a good thing about it. If you subscribe, it's behind the paywall. And the link in the LinkedIn piece that I saw wasn't to that. It was to something else, but I've not been able to find it. I'll see if I can. But the fact disconnect is the right word, because everything you talked about is about disconnects. And if we sort of know what they are, surely it's fixable, right?
I would hope. You know, I heard the theme of this year's IABC conference was connect. And I heard some people making fun of that. Everything is called Connect. Hell, my intranet is called Connect. But I think it's an apt theme for this year, considering disconnect is one of the primary issues that we're dealing with. People are disconnecting from the news. People are disconnecting from their organizations. They are disconnected from things they want to be connected to because they're not being provided with the information, the data, the resources to be connected. This is serious. Connection really needs to be a focus for communicators right now.
Yeah, and that plays into everything we've talked about over the last months, particularly starting with Edelman's trust barometer, trust in organizations, trust in leaders of organizations diminishing. And this adds to that, particularly if, I mean, I can picture it, Shell, a large organization that has people out in the field or in factories or whatever it is, they're not at a desk, so they're not going to be exposed to easy communication. You need to build that in. It reminds me of something I did when I was working at Mercer in the early 90s with a client. It was a company called Marion Merrill Dow that was in the pharma business. They had a sales force who were completely not getting any of the communication that employees got. So we developed a kind of radio station for them and recorded stuff that was mailed to them on cassette tapes. Because these are sales guys in cars, and they could put the cassette tape in the cassette player in the car. That's analog stuff for you. But surprisingly, to me, I recall highly effective communication based on surveys that we did. But that sort of idea was bold at that time for that company, that industry they were in. And it requires, in my view, just using that purely as an illustrative example, requires boldness to change these things in an organization. And that, to me, is something that is squarely within the realm of a communicator to do something about, it seems to me. So there's not a roadmap exactly, but there's a plan that you could see what you need to do. So why not do it? Easy as pie, right, Shell?
That's why everybody's doing it already, right?
You got it. So let's talk about AI again, actually. And this story I found quite interesting in Digiday. They talk about a new wave of automation is quietly reshaping how content creators engage with their audiences. That's forcing communicators and marketers to think differently about trust, control, and what authentic really means. So Digiday's report that was published on the 20th of June highlights the growing use of agentic AI by influencers. Now, we've talked about agentic AI before, but just briefly, agentic AI is AI systems that don't just respond to prompts, but act with autonomy, engaging people in comments and DMs using the creator's voice, tone, and even catchphrases related to this particular story. The result is that creators are seeing real gains, less burnout, more responsiveness, and deeper fan engagement. Agentic AI is redefining online interaction, helping creators stay present without being overwhelmed. But, says Digiday, there's a cost. Advertisers are growing cautious, with some now adding clauses to influencer contracts to ban AI-generated content altogether. The concern is that AI, no matter how well trained, could undermine the authenticity of the relationship between creator and audience, or even misrepresent the creator, especially in sensitive brand contexts. And then there's the ethical dimension. As agentic AI starts to simulate personality and build relationships, how should we think about its role? What happens when fans form connections with a chatbot, even if it sounds just like the person they follow? Despite concerns, Creators argue that AI interaction has improved their relationships with fans, made them more responsive, and enhanced engagement metrics, qualities brands still value. Still, communicators are now in new territory, navigating contracts, brand trust, and audience expectations all at once. It's no longer just about producing content. It's about managing relationships that may now be co-authored by machines. Which brings us to the larger point. As AI becomes a co-pilot in content and conversation, how do we define authenticity? How should brands and communicators navigate this new hybrid territory? What do you make of that, Shel?
You make sure that there's still a human in the loop, providing that oversight. I mean, you tell me whether you think this is an apt analogy, but there was a time when animation was done by hand. Each cell was drawn and painted. There were the people who did the main illustration and then the inkers who filled everything in. My dad worked for Disney, so I used to get to see some of these. I even have some cells. I have a cell from 101 Dalmatians, which was a hand-drawn, hand-painted motion picture. And then along comes computers, and suddenly it's all coding that's going into this. You look at anything that Pixar has done, and everybody, of course, sings the praises of the genius of Pixar, and it's the new way to deliver animation. I mean, how much does that take the humanity or the authenticity out of the equation or the creativity? And I got to tell you, Michelle and I, we were feeling like we just needed to turn our brains off, and we saw on one of the streaming channels that there was a full-length Looney Tunes movie, and it starred Daffy Duck and Porky Pig, and the description said it was 100% hand-drawn in the old Warner Brothers style, the Fritz Freleng, Chuck Jones style of animation. And we said, cool. And we watched it for about a half an hour, and we looked at each other and we said, the animation is incredible. It is just like it was in the 40s and the 50s. I mean, it's just amazing. The movie is terrible. It's not funny. It's stupid. It doesn't have any of the wit and charm or the grown-up humor that you turn to Warner Brothers cartoons for. Does doing it the old way guarantee that it's going to be authentic and credible? No, I think human creativity exhibits itself in the output, regardless of the tools that you are using. So if you are using agentic AI as a tool, how you use it and the controls that you exercise over it and how you partner with it as opposed to simply abdicating everything to it is going to determine whether the output is authentic and credible and clearly something that was driven by a creator as opposed to, this slop that we're seeing filling TikTok and YouTube these days.
That's a good argument you've made, and I'm going to think about that. But I agree with what you're saying. Add another dimension, which we touched on at the beginning of this show, which is what we're seeing with these newer tools coming out now of text to video, literally. The one I mentioned from Midjourney, my mind is still spinning with what I did with single photographs of two things in particular. One was a selfie of me, and the other one was a cartoon, very aimed at young toddlers type of style of a bunny rabbit. And I just didn't really tell it to do much, but I was blown away by what it came back with. So imagine that being employed with something like this. In fact, it's mind-boggling to think that through, because that is what's going to happen, actually.
Sure, but it's just a tool of computerized animation that makes it easier for you to realize your human vision.
Right, but you mentioned AI slop, and again, this now, does it not come back to the beauty in the eye of the beholder? One man's slop is another man's art, I would argue. We're going to see a lot of that.
We absolutely are, but I think we're going to also see a lot of remarkable creative stuff.
Agree.
Where these tools helped the creator achieve their vision. So I don't care what tools somebody uses. If it comes out as what they had envisioned. I want to see what they envisioned, regardless of whether they drew it by hand or used AI agents. I don't care.
With you 100% on that. I think exciting times are coming, Shell.
Exciting times are coming indeed, and we'll have to wait till next month to see what exciting times have transpired between now and then. Actually, we're going to be doing a few midweek episodes between now and our next episode, which we're going to record on July 26th. It'll drop on Monday, July 28th. So look forward to that. Keep an eye out for the midweek episodes. Also keep an eye out for an interview that we are planning to record this coming Thursday with Richard Bagnall, who is the volunteer head of AMEC. That's the International Association for the Measurement of Public Relations and Communications. And they have just come out with their most recent update to the Barcelona Principles. This is essentially a code of ethics for measurement. I remember the original Barcelona Principles, which was the first time we saw an official body say AVEs are bad, no advertising value equivalencies. And that's something I intend to ask him. Yeah, there are public relations agencies that still offer them. And when I asked the president of one of them, he said, our clients want them. So rather than educate the clients about why they're bad and why there are better metrics, the clients want it, so we're going to keep giving it to them, right? One of the questions I will undoubtedly ask. So that'll be coming up within the next month, too. In the meantime, we hope that you'll leave a comment somewhere about something that you have heard here or something that you would like to share. We had no comments this past month. Send a comment to fircomments@gmail.com. Include up to a 3-minute audio comment. Record that audio comment on our website. Just click the send voicemail link over on the right-hand side of the page, and you can record up to 90 seconds. You can record as many of those 90-second clips as you want. You can leave comments on the show notes. You can leave comments where we share the announcement that an episode has dropped on LinkedIn, Facebook, Threads, Mastodon, Blue Sky. We're pretty much everywhere except X, which is interesting because I have been hearing more and more that the AI community, and I'm talking about the CEOs and the AI engineers and the strategists, they're mainly on X. There is most of the communication between these people is happening on X, and that's what the AI podcast ends up saying is, the CEO of Anthropic said this on X, and Sam Altman said that on X. I may need to go back to X just to be able to stay up to date with what's happening in AI.
It's funny you mentioned that, just as a quick aside. That's been going through my mind a lot because some things I'm interested in, mostly from a personal point of view, I tend to, when I'm researching, find links or insights on X more than any other platform. And that gives me a major dilemma because I quit X in the audits. Am I going to go back? I don't know, but that's it's interesting.
I'm going to have to find a way to curate so that what I'm seeing is the AI stuff and avoiding however that algorithm pushes that vile stuff at you. I don't want that, but I do want to be where these AI thought leaders are sharing their thoughts. I mean, Ethan Mollick's on LinkedIn, which is great, and Chris Penn and a bunch of other people, but apparently X is the hub for all of this. So that will be a 30 for this episode of For Immediate Release.